Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a comparison between the Sony A7 Mark III on the left and the A7R Mark III on the right. Now, these are two very similar cameras, very different price points. With the A7 Mark II, you're looking at a $2,000 price point, of course, compatible with all E-mount glass, but because it's full frame, designed for FE, that is full frame E-mount glass. And this is a fantastic offering by Sony that really does change the landscape for just about everyone who has any sort of interest in photography, and in my opinion, having a real interchangeable lens camera that has just about every capability you could possibly want. Now, bear in mind, you can step up to something like the A7R Mark III, which retails at $3,200, so a significant increase in price there in terms of cost. And there are benefits. The primary one being megapixel count. Here we're looking at a 42 megapixel sensor. Here we're looking at a 24 megapixel sensor. Now that is the biggest difference between these two cameras, hands down. They both use the exact same battery type, which is Sony's new FZ1000 that has been incorporated into the lineup since the launch of the A9, Sony's fastest autofocus performance model in the lineup, also the most expensive at $4,500. And the FZ1000, as you can see right here, just has basically twice the performance of the previous generation battery that Sony was relying on for their cameras, both full frame and APS-C, as well as CyberShot. And that's something you need to know right off the bat. And the A7 Mark III does slightly edge out battery life performance over the A7R Mark III. So keep that in mind. So we've already established the Mark III, when it comes to the R, has higher resolution, as it should. It is the R after all. In terms of everything else, though, a key difference that the A7 Mark III has, which the R does not, is a superior autofocus system. Now, when I say superior, I'm not talking about mildly better. I'm talking about the exact same system you will find in the A9, which again retails for $4,500. So with the A7 III, the brand new offering, you have 693 points of phase detection on the sensor. That's 93% coverage of the entire full frame sensor. With the more expensive 42 plus megapixel A7R Mark III, you only have 399 points of autofocus in terms of phase detection points. So 693 versus 399, a big difference. Now, when it comes to shooting stills, both cap out at 10 frames per second max, but of course you have a superior autofocus system with the A7 Mark III and its lower megapixel count sensor, that 24 megapixel sensor. So while you don't have as much detail as you do with the R Mark III, you certainly have superior autofocus capability, which may end up netting more keepers. And unless you're really a landscape still life photographer, then clearly the A7 Mark III seems to be the no-brainer here, being that it's far less money. You could afford yourself a nice piece of glass to add to it with the already built-in price of the $3,200 that the A7R Mark III commands right out of the gate. In terms of going beyond the autofocus, again, remember, both of them have 10 frames per second, but again, you're not going to have the autofocus prowess with the A7R Mark III. It does not mean the A7R Mark III's autofocus capability is poor by any means. It just simply isn't as comprehensive as what you're given or getting in the A7 Mark III. Moving beyond that, in terms of the stabilization for both of these cameras, they both are blessed, thankfully, with 5-axis image stabilization, and that has become pretty much standard for Sony now, and it is a differentiator for them from the rest of the entire DI world. If you're looking for cameras where you can adapt legacy glass from other manufacturers, the fact that you have 5-axis image stabilization is a blessing. It's a blessing for video. I mean, there are so many advantages to having Sony's 5-axis system, and they're not the only ones with with the 5-axis system, but they are the only ones with a 5-axis system with a $2,000 price point, with all of the features that they really have here. So both cameras have pretty much, as you may have already noticed, nearly the identical layout, ergonomics, everything. The EVF is in the exact same location, although I do have to point out that the EVF in the A7R Mark III, the more expensive of the two cameras, is significantly better. And that's simply because it has a higher quality EVF, higher resolution. Would I love to see 4K EVFs in both of these cameras? Yes, we're not there yet. We're looking at, I believe, 2.8 or 2.6 million dots. Here it's 3.6, so you're getting a lot more visual information. And when it comes to an electronic viewfinder, whether you're a novice or a pro, you're going to instantly recognize that. You will notice that inherently. And the A7R Mark III does come out ahead there. So if you plan on leaning on the EVF consistently, you may be slightly disappointed with what you'll find in the A7 Mark III, but I do not think that should in any way inhibit you from picking one up, because overall you'll be leaving a lot on the table because of its comprehensive feature set. So beyond the 5-axis image stabilization, the other thing that the A7R Mark III, or I should say that it does have that the A7 Mark III does not, is pixel shift technology, which some will call a gimmick, others will actually give it true street cred here. But it's just something I want to mention in passing. Also, the A7R Mark III does have the ability to sync with a flash. That is something that you do not have on the A7 Mark III. So the R, as you can see right there, I opened all the ports, the bays on the left-hand side of the body, and if I can move them all out of the way, you'll see we've got, headphone, microphone, Type-C port, the multi, aka micro USB port, and the flash sync, and of course HDMI out. Now, when I go over to the less expensive and newer A7 Mark III, we have all of those things except for, as I just mentioned, the actual flash sync. So it's Sony's way of attempting to differentiate in terms of product line. You can see it's just a black piece of plastic there. So nothing there, but we have everything else. Both cameras, Wi-Fi, NFC, both of course can shoot 4K video. No pixel binning here. With the A7 Mark III, essentially what Sony is doing is recording 4K at 24p in 6K and then downsampling it to UHD resolution. If you go to 30p, that is 4K 30p, they will be downsampling it from 5K. Now, with the A7R Mark III, maybe a slight video advantage because they're downsampling from 5K, but the Super 35 mode does, from what I've seen, outperform what the A7 Mark III has to offer. Now, does it outperform it for the cost difference, the premium you're paying for the R Mark III? I don't think so. I think anyone will agree that the video that will come out of the A7 Mark III is beyond fantastic. So for the price difference, you better be picking up the A7R Mark III specifically for its still prowess, that 42 megapixel sensor, again, that is really truly its selling point. I've already mentioned battery, life, that the A7 Mark III is going to slightly outperform the A7R Mark III, which is relevant, but it's only by a small margin. So while the A7 Mark III may be Sony's most efficient full-frame mirrorless camera to date, it's not enough of a margin for me to really say, hey, you should be picking this up instead of the Mark III. Again, it all comes down to resolution and autofocus. That's what this comparison really is comprised of, because that is the real difference between these two cameras. Now, when it comes to shooting, I said 10 frames per second. Both cameras have dual SD card slots. Same exact layout. We've got a UHS-1 as well as a UHS-2 port, slot rather. And of course, many people would have liked to have seen two UHS-2 slots rather than a 1 and a 2, and I understand. I'm with you. But it is what it is. Now, when it comes to buffer, I mentioned 10 frames per second. With the A7 Mark III, you can capture over 170 shots, JPEGs, before you fill that buffer. With the A7R Mark III, because you have nearly twice the resolution, you're looking at more around in the 70s when it comes to JPEGs. The interesting thing is when it comes to RAW, they're about the same. When you're shooting RAW, the buffer will fill up at about, again, in the 70s on both of these. So just so you know, yes, with the JPEGs, you will fare better with that lower resolution 24 megapixel sensor, but when it comes to RAW shooting, they're about the same in terms of the buffer filling up and you having to actually stop and wait. Other things you should know, both of these are really supposed to be weather-sealed cameras, but I would not recommend really testing that out. I don't think it's a good idea. I wouldn't go out of my way to see how much they can withstand. They both have touch screens on the back. The actual screens are the exact same resolution, so there you're not getting the drop-off like you are in the electronic viewfinder realm, for those of you that are wondering. The button layout is pretty much identical. You can see it right there. Whether we're talking about the joystick, the jog dial, everything, the grip, the video recording button, of course, the body style is identical. And so is the entire walk around the body. The A7R Mark III seems to have a little more heft to it. But again, as I mentioned, weather sealing, some have said the A7R Mark III is not that great with weather sealing. Don't expect better weather sealing with the A7 Mark III. I'm just putting it out there. That doesn't mean that there is not some level of resistance. There is. This camera's gotten wet, but I would not recommend shooting in the rain unless you have insurance that actually is going to cover you, of course. I've already mentioned the flash sync support. For some of you, that's going to be critical, and for those people, you've got to go with the higher end. If it's not critical, again, the A7 just seems to be a winner in every facet. Form, function, yes, it doesn't have the resolution that the A7R Mark III has, but you can buy a lens instead of having that extra resolution, and many photographers, both professional and hobbyist enthusiasts alike, really don't necessarily need the 42 megapixels. Don't get me wrong, I love it. And it's fantastic if you're trying to crop, find the image within the image, get finer detail that you just simply can't get with 24 megapixels. But if you aren't one of those people, like I said, landscape is not, still life is not your specialty, then clearly the A7, hands down, seems to take the cake because it has all of the nuances, the niceties, other than the EVF quality and pixel shift technology, which is only specific to the A7R Mark III. It has all of those things, the dual SD card slot, the buffer capability, the touch focus, the 5-axis image stabilization, the great 4K video that is avoiding pixel binning by downsampling from higher resolutions. Again, Super 35 video, a little bit better out of the A7R Mark III, but all of those things, and then the price, $2,000 versus $3,200. So, very compelling cameras, both of them. I think they both have their place in the photographic world, but I think the moral of this story is that, like I've been repeating throughout the course of this video, unless you must have the highest resolution sensor, if you're trying to get close to medium format quality while still in the realm of just full frame, which is what the A7R Mark III really does, if you're not trying to do that, if you just want a solid overall performer that has basically every capability you could desire, except for that flash sync, the A7 Mark III does it, and does it at a price that no one else in the business can accommodate. So there is no competing product to this right now from any other company. Furthermore, At the price point, you buy less camera. You buy APS-C, you buy Micro Four Thirds, whatever your mirrorless option is, it will be inferior to what the A7 Mark III brings to the table. In this comparison, of course, the A7R Mark III, I think, is the better of the two cameras if you're a purist for the resolution aspect. But if you care more about the autofocus and less about the megapixel count, then the Mark III is the winner. And from what I've seen, the Mark III in low light can outperform the A7R Mark III, which isn't surprising because of the megapixel ratio here, 24 to 42. It should do better in low light just based on logic. But again, two fantastic cameras, two cameras that I think a lot of people are going to look at and compare and try to decide which is better for them. I think for the vast majority of users, it's the A7 Mark III. And then again, those megapixel purists that must have the best, or I should say, the highest amount of photographic image or photographic information that can be captured, that is what the A7R Mark III accomplishes. You want something close to medium format without actually going medium format? This is the camera for you. You want the best full-frame mirrorless camera that money can buy? The A7R Mark III is it. I mean, it's got it all, as I've mentioned. The stabilization, the battery life, the autofocus being really the key. I mean, the A9 system, you're just not getting the 20 frames per second that the A9 can do. You're getting the 10, but at the same precision. That, to me, in itself, as long as you can live without the extra megapixels, makes the A7 Mark III the most desirable camera on the market. And quite frankly, the back order right now reflects that. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.